In the village of Rosehill, people were accustomed to small excitements. A disagreement over dahlias at the Horticultural Society could sustain conversation for 3 weeks. The vicar's wife changing butcher was regarded as faintly scandalous. A mysterious motor car scene near the post office after dusk might produce endless speculation over tea at the Bluebell Café. But no one in Rosehill had ever imagined murder. The autumn fete had been planned for months. Mrs. Dalrymple, who chaired nearly every committee of consequence in the village, declared repeatedly that it would restore morale after a dreary season of rain and influenza. The church hall was decorated with orange ribbons and bowls of late chrysanthemums. Trestle tables groaned beneath seed cakes, pork pies, and jars of damson preserve. Outside, children chased one another across the green while the brass band from Marlacombe played selections that were half a beat behind themselves. At the far edge of the field stood the evening centerpiece, a towering bonfire assembled from old timber, hedge trimmings, broken chairs, and crates donated by the brewery. "It's much too large," said Miss Jane Marple mildly. She sat wrapped in a soft grey shawl beside her friend Mrs. Bantry, observing the preparations with bright, faded blue eyes that missed very little. "Nonsense," declared Mrs. Bantry. "Young Tom Fletcher insisted on doing it properly this year. Men are absurd about bonfires. The larger the fire, the more primitive they become." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Large fires," she said, "have always struck me as rather revealing." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "My dear Jane, you make even Guy Fawkes sound psychological." "That is because nearly everything is psychological," Miss Marple replied. Not far away, Dr. Lionel Carew stood among a circle of villagers, handsome and easy in manner, accepting congratulations with modest amusement. He was a newcomer to Rosehill, having purchased Ashcombe House only 18 months earlier. At 45, he possessed the polished confidence of a successful London physician, though rumour suggested he had retired rather suddenly from practice. Women admired him, men distrusted him a little, which Miss Marple often thought was generally sensible. Beside Dr. Carew stood his wife, Evelyn, a pale, elegant woman with dark hair swept neatly beneath a velvet hat. She smiled when spoken to, but there was something strained about her expression, as though each polite remark cost her effort. "She looks tired," Miss Marple observed softly. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice at once. "They say the marriage is not a happy one." "My dear Dolly, people always say that." "Yes, but in this case it happens to be true." Miss Marple said nothing. She was watching Evelyn Carew closely. The woman had turned suddenly toward the bonfire. For the briefest instant, genuine fear crossed her face. Not dislike, not anxiety. Then, almost immediately, it vanished. The brass bands stumbled into a patriotic march. Children shrieked with delight as Mr. Pritchard, the grocer, began distributing sparklers. Somewhere nearby, glasses clinked. And over all of it lay the peculiar excitement villagers feel at communal rituals, an excitement that is half pleasure and half danger. By 7:30 darkness had settled fully across Rosehill. Lanterns swung from hooks beside the church gate. The bonfire loomed against the night sky like some enormous black animal waiting to wake. Tom Fletcher approached, carrying a flaming torch. "Stand back, everyone!" The villagers gathered eagerly. Faces glowed gold in the torchlight. Smoke drifted cold and bitter through the air. Tom thrust the torch deep into the base of the woodpile. For a moment nothing happened. Then came a low crackling sound. Flames stirred. A cheer rose from the crowd as fire climbed swiftly upward through the stacked timber, bright orange against the dark. Children clapped. Someone began singing. And then Mrs. Dalrymple screamed. It was not the kind of scream that comes from surprise. It was raw and terrible, a sound of absolute horror. The singing stopped at once. Several people turned sharply toward the flames. At first Miss Marple saw nothing unusual. The fire roared fiercely now, sparks spiraling upward into the blackness. Then the wind shifted. Something inside the bonfire moved. A shape. Not falling timber. Not burning branches. A human arm. For one dreadful second the arm lifted clear through the flames, blackened and terrible, before collapsing inward again. Panic exploded across the green. Women cried out. Someone shouted for water. Children were dragged backward. Tom Fletcher stumbled away from the fire, white-faced and shaking violently. "The fire, dear God!" Dr. Carew pushed forward immediately, commanding people aside. "Move back! Everyone move back!" Men seized long poles and began pulling apart the burning structure. Smoke billowed thickly across the field. Sparks showered upward in furious bursts. Miss Marple remained seated. not from indifference, but because at her age sudden confusion was best observed quietly. Beside her, Mrs. Bantry gripped her arm hard. "Janet—" Miss Marple did not answer. The villagers watched in horrified silence as the truth emerged from the collapsing flames. There could be no doubt. A body had been hidden inside the bonfire before it was lit. 20 minutes later, Superintendent Harold Pierce arrived from Malacombe Police Station. He was a broad, capable-looking man with a heavy moustache and the tired patience of someone long accustomed to village melodrama. Yet even he seemed shaken by what awaited him. The remains had been laid beneath a canvas sheet near the church wall. Dr. Carrow emerged from examining them, his face grim. "Well?" Pierce asked quietly. Carrow removed his gloves. "A man," he said. "Dead before the fire was lit, I think. Blunt trauma to the skull." A murmur spread through the gathered villagers. Pierce nodded once. Dr. Carrow hesitated. He looked toward the crowd. "It's Gerald Finch." The effect was immediate. Several women gasped aloud. Mr. Pritchard muttered, "Good Lord!" And somewhere near the back of the crowd someone whispered, "I knew there'd be trouble." Gerald Finch was not beloved in Rosehill. He owned several cottages in the village and was notorious for squeezing tenants mercilessly over rent and repairs. He drank too much, spoke too loudly, and possessed the unpleasant habit of learning secrets that were none of his business. There were people in Rosehill who actively hated him. Too many people, Miss Marple thought at once. That was unfortunate. Superintendent Pierce began questioning witnesses immediately. Who had seen Finch last? Had anyone noticed unusual behavior near the bonfire? Who had access to the woodpile before evening? Answers came quickly, chaotically, and often contradicted one another. "He argued with Fletcher yesterday." "No, it was Tuesday. I saw him near Hollow Lane." "He threatened somebody at the Bluebell Cafe." "It was money, I expect." "No, woman." Villages, Miss Marple reflected, were rather like ponds. Throw in one stone and all the mud rises at once. She noticed Evelyn Carrow standing apart from the others beneath a lantern near the church gate. The woman appeared deathly pale. Her gloved hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple rose carefully and crossed toward her. "My dear," she said gently, "you should sit down." Evelyn started violently. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it?" "I'm perfectly all right." But she was not all right. Miss Marple observed many things simultaneously. The woman's strained composure, the ash smudge upon her sleeve, and most particularly the expression in her eyes. Not grief, not shock. Recognition. "You knew Mr. Finch well?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Evelyn hesitated just a fraction too long. "Only slightly." "How unpleasant this must be for everyone." "Yes," Evelyn whispered. Then, abruptly, "Some fires never truly go out, do they?" The words hung strangely in the cold air. Before Miss Marple could reply, Dr. Carrow approached. "There you are, Evelyn. You shouldn't be standing in this damp." His tone was kind. Yet Miss Marple noticed his hand close firmly around his wife's elbow, not violently, but possessively. Evelyn lowered her eyes at once. "We're going home," Carrow said pleasantly to Miss Marple. "A dreadful evening." "Yes, indeed." The doctor inclined his head politely and led his wife away toward the lane beyond the church. Miss Marple watched them disappear into the mist. Then she looked back toward the dying bonfire. Most of the flames had been extinguished now. Smoke drifted low across the field, carrying with it the bitter smell of charred wood and something far worse beneath. Superintendent Pierce stood nearby speaking to Tom Fletcher, who appeared close to collapse. The young man kept repeating the same sentence. "I didn't know he was in there. I swear I didn't know." Miss Marple believed him. Not because innocence was obvious, it relieved him. Not because innocence was obvious, it rarely was, but because terror of that kind could seldom be imitated successfully. A small detail caught her attention then. Near the edge of the ruined bonfire lay a fragment of fabric untouched by flame. Dark blue velvet. Miss Marple bent carefully and picked it up. Very soft, expensive, and faintly scented with lavender. She slipped it quietly into her handbag. No one noticed. Above the village green the smoke continued to rise into the autumn sky, twisting slowly like something alive. And Miss Marple, looking into the ashes, had the distinct feeling that Gerald Finch's death was not the beginning of the story. It was merely the fire breaking through the surface. By the following morning, Rosehill had divided itself neatly into two categories of people: those who discussed the murder openly, and those who discussed it while pretending not to. At the Bluebell Cafe, voices dropped theatrically whenever the door opened. Curtains twitched along Hollow Lane. Mrs. Pritchard claimed 3 separate customers had purchased newspapers solely to appear unconcerned while listening to conversation. Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to understand the enormous social importance of pretending not to gossip, took breakfast in her cottage with quiet composure. Outside, the village wore the washed, damp appearance peculiar to English autumn mornings. Rain had fallen during the night. Fallen leaves clung to the pavement in dark clusters, and the air still carried the faint smoky scent of the bonfire. Miss Marple buttered a piece of toast thoughtfully while Florence, her maid, rattled cups with unusual force. "Well," Florence announced, "it's wickedness, that's what it is." Miss Marple murmured agreement. "They say poor Mr. Fletcher was nearly arrested on the spot." "People always say a great many things," Miss Marple observed. Florence lowered her voice instinctively. "And Mrs. Carrow fainted dead away after she got home." "Did she indeed?" "So Mrs. Elcott told Mrs. Simmons, and she heard it from the gardener at Ashcombe House." Miss Marple concealed a faint smile. Village information travelled through servants with astonishing speed and almost military efficiency. One learned to respect it. "She was upset yesterday evening," Miss Marple said carefully. Florence sniffed. "Well, if you ask me, anyone would be upset after seeing a dead body burnt half to cinders. That is certainly true." But Miss Marple was not thinking of Evelyn Carrow's distress. She was thinking of fear, not the horror of seeing death, the horror of expecting it. After breakfast she put on her coat and set out toward the village green. The remains of the fete still lingered sadly in the damp morning light. A torn ribbon fluttered against the church railings. Muddy wheel tracks scarred the grass where police vehicles had stood during the night. Near the blackened remains of the bonfire stood Superintendent Pierce, smoking a pipe while 2 constables examined the ground. Pierce noticed Miss Marple approaching and removed the pipe politely. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Superintendent. You must have had a very long night." He grimaced. "One of the longest." Pierce liked Miss Marple. Most sensible policemen eventually did, though often reluctantly at first. Her appearance suggested harmless elderly gentility, but experience had taught him that she observed more than most trained investigators. Still, he remained cautious. Professional pride demanded it. "Any developments?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "A few." His tone suggested he had no intention of elaborating further. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly as though perfectly satisfied. Pierce hesitated, then sighed. "Well, to be frank, the case appears rather straightforward." "That is often encouraging," said Miss Marple, "and occasionally misleading." Pierce gave her a sharp look. "The victim argued publicly with Tom Fletcher 2 days ago. Several witnesses confirm it. About the bonfire, I believe?" Pierce blinked slightly.
"Yes."
Finch threatened to report Fletcher to the parish council for illegal timber cutting. How unpleasant. "And Fletcher was seen near the woodpile late yesterday afternoon." Miss Marple bent her head thoughtfully. "A very unfortunate circumstance." Pierce studied her expression. "You disagree?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple gently. "I merely find unfortunate circumstances very common in murder cases." Before Pierce could reply, one of the constables approached, carrying a muddy object wrapped carefully in cloth. "Found near the hedgerow, sir." Pierce unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a heavy iron poker blackened with soot. Even at a distance, Miss Marple could see the dark brown staining near its handle. Pierce's face hardened immediately. "Well," he said, "that rather settles matters." Miss Marple did not answer. She was looking instead toward Hollow Lane. A woman stood there watching them from beneath a dark umbrella. Evelyn Carrow. The moment she realized Miss Marple had noticed her, she turned abruptly away. Curious, thought Miss Marple. Very curious indeed. By noon the village had reached a consensus. Tom Fletcher was guilty. The evidence seemed overwhelming. He had quarreled with Gerald Finch repeatedly. He possessed a violent temper when provoked. Most damaging of all, the poker had apparently been identified as belonging to the Fletcher cottage. Rose Hill discussed little else. At the butcher's shop, Mrs. Elcott declared loudly that she had always distrusted emotional young men. At the post office, Mr. Hargreaves insisted the matter was obvious from the beginning. By luncheon, several villagers had already begun speaking of the crime as though it had been solved entirely. Miss Marple distrusted swift certainty. Human beings, she reflected, preferred tidy explanations because they feared complicated truths. That afternoon she paid a visit to Mrs. Bantry. Dolly Bantry received her in the drawing-room at Gorsemead with dramatic enthusiasm. "Jane, thank heavens you've come. Colonel Bantry has done nothing but discuss bloodstains all morning." From behind his newspaper the colonel grunted. Police work's simpler these days. Everyone leaves fingerprints and confessions lying about. Miss Marple seated herself beside the fire. I wonder if it truly is simpler. Mrs. Bantry poured tea immediately. Well, the entire village believes young Fletcher did it. And you don't? Miss Marple accepted her tea slowly before answering. My dear Dolly, whenever everyone believes exactly the same thing, I become very uneasy. The Colonel lowered his newspaper. You think Pierce is wrong? I think Superintendent Pierce is intelligent, said Miss Marple carefully. But intelligence is sometimes endangered by evidence that appears too convenient. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. You've noticed something. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only small things, such as the poker, for example. Leaving the murder weapon beside a hedgerow where it might easily be discovered seems rather careless. Well, murderers are careless. Some are. But Gerald Finch was hidden inside a bonfire before hundreds of people arrived at the fete. That required planning. The Colonel frowned. And then there is Mrs. Carrow. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened instantly. I knew she was involved somehow. My dear Dolly, involvement and guilt are entirely different matters. But she behaved oddly. Miss Marple stirred her tea absently. She looked like a woman who feared something long before the body appeared. A brief silence followed. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Then Colonel Bantry said unexpectedly, Finch used to visit Ashcombe House rather frequently. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Indeed? Oh, yes. Saw him there myself twice last month. Mrs. Bantry frowned. I thought Carrow disliked him. So he did, said the Colonel. That's what made it peculiar. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. People rarely entertained those they despised unless necessity compelled them. And necessity, in her experience, was very often connected with secrets. As dusk approached, Miss Marple walked home by way of Hollow Lane. The hedges were wet with rain. Smoke still lingered faintly over the village, though the bonfire itself had long been extinguished. Halfway down the lane she heard voices, a man and a woman. Instinctively she paused behind the hedge. Can't continue like this, a woman whispered urgently. Evelyn Carrow. You must calm yourself, came her husband's voice. You said he would leave us alone. He would have if he hadn't become greedy. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. He knew too much, Evelyn said shakily. A long silence followed. Then Dr. Carrow spoke very softly. What's done is done. Miss Marple heard Evelyn give a small, frightened sound. You don't understand, she whispered. The fire, I keep seeing it. Pull yourself together. His tone had changed entirely now, and beneath it unmistakably dangerous. Miss Marple moved quietly away before she could hear more. Her old bones ached slightly in the damp air, but her mind had become extraordinarily alert. Blackmail, she thought? Gerald Finch had been blackmailing someone. And if so, his murder was no impulsive village quarrel at all. It had been carefully arranged. As she reached the gate to her cottage, she paused suddenly. Someone was standing in the shadows beside the garden wall. Tom Fletcher. The young man looked exhausted. His clothes were crumpled, his face hollow with strain. Miss Marple, he said hoarsely, they're going to arrest me. She regarded him quietly. Perhaps they are. I didn't kill him. I know. The words escaped him almost like a sob. You believe me? Tom stared at her in astonishment. Why? Miss Marple folded her hands gently atop her walking-stick. Because, she said, you are frightened in the wrong way. He blinked. I don't understand. Murderers are usually afraid of being caught, Miss Marple said softly. You are afraid no one will listen. For a moment the young man looked perilously close to tears. Then he said quietly, There's something else. Miss Marple waited. Tom glanced nervously behind him before continuing. Yesterday afternoon I saw someone near the bonfire. He swallowed. Dr. Carew. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The wind stirred wet leaves across the lane, carrying with it the faint scent of chimney smoke from cottages beyond the green. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and fell silent. Miss Marple regarded Tom Fletcher steadily. Are you quite certain? She asked at last. Tom nodded immediately. You saw Dr. Carew near the bonfire yesterday afternoon? He was coming from the field just before dusk. I remember because it seemed odd. Tom rubbed his hands together nervously. Everyone else was helping set up tables near the church hall. He was alone. Did he see you? I don't think so. Miss Marple considered. And you did not tell the police? Tom gave a bitter laugh. They already think I murdered Finch. If I start accusing respectable people, I'll sound desperate. Which Miss Marple reflected privately was perfectly true. Desperation was unfortunate because it often resembled guilt. "You were wise not to rush about making accusations," she said kindly. "Excited people frequently confuse what they think they saw with what actually occurred." Tom's shoulders sagged slightly. "But I did see him." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I believe you probably did." The young man looked at her almost helplessly. "What am I supposed to do?" "For the moment, nothing." "That's impossible." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It is merely difficult." She moved toward her gate. "Go home, Mr. Fletcher. Try to remain calm. Panic leads people into very unfortunate mistakes." He hesitated. "You really think someone else killed Finch?" Miss Marple paused before answering. "Gerald Finch appears to have been the sort of man many people wished dead," she said quietly. "One must always be careful when a murder is too convenient." She left him standing beneath the dripping hedgerow and went inside. That evening Rose Hill settled uneasily beneath low clouds and persistent rain. Lights glowed warmly behind curtained windows. Teacups rattled. Conversations continued in lowered voices all across the village, and at Ashcombe House Evelyn Caro sat alone in the drawing-room staring into the fire. The room was elegant without being comfortable. Dr. Caro had furnished the house in expensive dark woods and polished leather that impressed visitors while discouraging relaxation. Even the fire seemed carefully arranged. Evelyn sat rigidly upright, one hand clenched tightly in her lap. She had not touched her tea. Across the room Lionel Caro poured himself a whiskey. "You ought to eat something," he remarked casually. "I'm not hungry." "You'll make yourself ill." A faint smile touched Evelyn's mouth. "How considerate." He glanced at her sharply. "You're becoming overwrought again." "Am I?" The doctor crossed to the mantelpiece. "For heaven's sake, Evelyn, you must stop behaving as though the entire village is watching us." Her eyes lifted slowly to his. "They are watching us. Nonsense. They know something's wrong." "No," said Lionel calmly. "They merely enjoy gossip." He sipped his whiskey. "Villagers always need a tragedy to discuss." Evelyn looked back into the flames. "Yes," she murmured, "and now they have one." A silence settled between them. At length she said, "Did you kill him?" The question entered the room quietly, almost gently. Yet it altered everything. Lionel did not move at once. Then he set down his glass with extreme care. "What an extraordinary thing to ask. You didn't answer." He turned toward her slowly. "No." Evelyn studied him with exhausted eyes. "You're lying." For the first time something dangerous flickered across his expression. "You are becoming hysterical." "No," she said. "Only frightened." He walked toward her then and stood over her chair. "My dear Evelyn," he said softly, "you really must learn the difference." She shrank slightly beneath his gaze. After a moment he smiled again, pleasant, charming, entirely controlled. "You should go upstairs and rest." Evelyn rose without replying. At the doorway she paused. "He told me something before he died." Lionel's voice remained calm. "Did he?" "What exactly?" But Evelyn shook her head. "I don't think I shall tell you." For one brief instant their eyes met, and in that instant Evelyn realized something with dreadful certainty. Her husband was afraid. The following morning brought arrests. Superintendent Pierce arrived at the Fletcher cottage shortly after 8, accompanied by 2 constables. By 9 o'clock the entire village knew Tom Fletcher had been taken into custody for the murder of Gerald Finch. Rose Hill responded with enormous satisfaction. People always preferred events to proceed according to expectation. At the Bluebell Café, Mrs. Elcott announced loudly that she had seen it coming from the start. Mr. Pritchard declared the evidence perfectly obvious. Even those who expressed pity did so with unmistakable relief. The matter, they felt, had become simple again. Miss Marple, however, found simplicity deeply suspicious. She spent the morning knitting beside her window while reflecting upon several unpleasant inconsistencies. Firstly, hiding a body inside a bonfire required nerve and preparation. Secondly, Tom Fletcher lacked both subtlety and self-control. Thirdly, Gerald Finch had almost certainly been blackmailing someone connected with Ashcombe House. And finally, perhaps most troubling of all, Evelyn Caro behaved not like a conspirator, but like a woman trapped. That distinction mattered enormously. Just after 11 there came a knock at the cottage door. Florence admitted Superintendent Pierce. The policeman removed his hat heavily. "I suppose," he said, "that you disapprove." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "My dear Superintendent, policemen do not arrest people merely for my approval." Pierce snorted despite himself. "Though perhaps we'd all save time if we did." Florence brought tea and withdrew discreetly. Pierce accepted a cup. "We've enough evidence for a formal charge," he said. "The poker belonged to Fletcher. Witnesses confirmed the quarrel. Finch threatened him publicly. And Fletcher cannot properly account for his movements yesterday afternoon." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Can anyone?" Pierce frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well, villages are curious places. People observe one another constantly, yet seldom accurately." Pierce leaned back. "You think someone's lying?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that fear causes people to omit things." The superintendent studied her shrewdly. "You've heard something." Miss Marple smiled over her teacup. "One hears many things." Miss Marple, but she interrupted gently. "Tell me, Superintendent, was Gerald Finch a wealthy man?" Pierce looked surprised by the question. "Comfortably off. No family?" "A widowed sister in Bournemouth." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And his papers? Business records? Letters?" "We're examining them." Pierce paused. "Why?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "Because men like Gerald Finch usually collect unpleasant little treasures. Secrets. Correspondence." She glanced toward the window. "Blackmail is such a profitable hobby." Pierce stared at her. "You believe Finch was blackmailing someone?" "I should think it highly probable." The superintendent's expression darkened slowly. "Why didn't you mention this sooner?" "My dear superintendent," said Miss Marple gently, "you never asked." He gave an exasperated sound. Then, after a pause, Miss Marple shook her head. "That I don't yet know," which was not entirely true. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that certainty arrived in layers. One must never speak too soon. After Pierce departed, Miss Marple took out the small fragment of blue velvet she had recovered beside the bonfire. She examined it carefully beneath the light. Excellent material, from an expensive garment, and carrying a faint trace of lavender perfume. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Yesterday evening Evelyn Carrow had worn dark blue velvet gloves, not merely similar, precisely the same shade. At that exact moment another thought occurred to her, a very uncomfortable one. Suppose Evelyn Carrow had been near the bonfire before the fete began. Suppose Gerald Finch had arranged to meet her there. Suppose someone else had followed. Miss Marple folded the velvet carefully away once more. Outside, rain clouds drifted low over Rosehill, and somewhere beyond the village, hidden beneath quiet routines and polite smiles, the truth waited patiently among the ashes. Rain continued for 3 days. It fell softly upon Rosehill's narrow lanes and drummed steadily against cottage windows, wrapping the village in a damp, uneasy quiet. Smoke rose from chimneys in pale grey ribbons, and people found endless excuses to remain indoors discussing murder beside their fires. Miss Marple did not mind the rain. Bad weather, she often reflected, encouraged observation. People deprived of activity usually revealed themselves through conversation. On Thursday afternoon she accepted an invitation to tea at Ashcombe House. The invitation itself had arrived unexpectedly by hand that morning, written in a delicate slanting script upon cream paper. "Dear Miss Marple, I wonder if you would do me the kindness of visiting this afternoon. There are 1 or 2 matters upon which I should value your advice. Yours sincerely, Evelyn Carrow." Miss Marple read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it beside her teacup. "Something wrong, miss?" Florence asked. "Possibly," said Miss Marple. "Will you go?" "Oh, yeah." Because frightened women did not summon elderly ladies for casual conversation during murder investigations. Ashcombe House stood at the far edge of the village beyond Hollow Lane, surrounded by dripping yew hedges and bare autumn trees. It had once belonged to a prosperous brewer, but had changed hands several times after the war. Miss Marple had always thought it a melancholy house. Beautiful, certainly, but joyless. A maid admitted her and led her into the drawing-room. Evelyn Carrow stood near the window wearing a dark green afternoon dress that emphasized the paleness of her face. There were shadows beneath her eyes, and her composure appeared strained almost to breaking. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, "thank you for coming. My dear Mrs. Carrow." They sat opposite one another while tea was brought. For several moments Evelyn busied herself nervously with the teapot, spilling a few drops onto the tray. "You wish to speak with me?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Evelyn's hands tightened, but she did not continue immediately. Instead, she stared toward the rain-streaked windows. "I used to think villages were peaceful," she said suddenly. "Before we came here," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is because villages conceal things so well." Evelyn gave a small, humorless laugh. A silence followed. Then she said quietly, "Do you believe Tom Fletcher killed Gerald Finch?" Miss Marple considered her carefully before replying. "No." Evelyn looked down at once, almost as though relief had escaped her involuntarily. "Neither do I." "You knew Mr. Finch rather well?" The woman hesitated. "He knew my husband first, in London." Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly against her teacup. Gerald Finch was the sort of man who made himself useful. He remembered things, collected information. She swallowed. "And eventually he learned how profitable information can become." "Blackmail," said Miss Marple softly. Evelyn flinched. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. Miss Marple waited. Patience, she knew, was among the greatest advantages of old age. Young people hurried toward confessions. Elderly women could simply remain silent until truth grew uncomfortable enough to emerge on its own. At last Evelyn spoke again. "My husband had difficulties years ago in London." "What sort of difficulties?" "A patient died." Miss Marple remained perfectly still. "The family threatened scandal," Evelyn continued. "There was talk of negligence, drugs missing from the clinic, rumors in newspapers, but no charges?" "No." "And Gerald Finch knew about this?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "He knew everything." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Was the story true?" For a moment Evelyn seemed about to answer. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. Her face changed instantly. Fear again. The door opened. Dr. Lionel Carrow entered smiling pleasantly. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed. "What a charming surprise." His tone was effortless, too effortless. Miss Marple had known men like Lionel Carrow before, polished men who used charm not naturally but professionally, as one might employ a surgical instrument. "We were just having tea," Evelyn said quickly. "So I see." He crossed the room smoothly and poured himself a cup. "You'll forgive my interruption. I've spent the entire morning dealing with reporters from Marlicombe." "How tiresome," said Miss Marple. "Oh, not especially. One learns to tolerate curiosity after a while." He glanced toward his wife. "Evelyn tires herself unnecessarily over these dreadful events. She has naturally been upset," Miss Marple observed. "Yes," said Carrow softly. "Naturally?" Something unspoken passed between husband and wife then. Miss Marple noticed it at once. A warning. Invisible perhaps to others, but unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime observing marriages. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Dr. Carrow turned back pleasantly. "Have the police troubled you at all, Miss Marple?" "Oh, no." Superintendent Pierce merely asked a few ordinary questions. "And what do you think of his theory regarding Fletcher?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I think policemen are often happiest when theories arrive quickly." Carrow laughed. "Quite so." Yet his eyes remained watchful, careful, as though weighing every word spoken in the room. After another 10 minutes Miss Marple rose to leave. Evelyn accompanied her into the hall. The moment they were beyond earshot, the younger woman seized Miss Marple's hand suddenly. "You must help him," she whispered desperately. "Tom Fletcher?" "Why?" Evelyn's face had become deathly pale. "Because he's innocent." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "And who is guilty?" Evelyn opened her mouth. Then footsteps approached from the drawing-room. Immediately she released Miss Marple's hand. Dr. Carrow appeared in the doorway, smiling. "Leaving us already?" "I'm afraid so," said Miss Marple pleasantly. The doctor took her coat himself. "How fortunate Rosehill is to possess such devoted observers of village life." The remark sounded harmless, yet Miss Marple detected something beneath it, testing whether she suspected more than she admitted. She met his gaze mildly. "My dear Dr. Carrow, villagers observe themselves." For the first time his smile faltered slightly. Only slightly, but enough. As Miss Marple walked back toward the lane, she reflected upon the encounter with growing unease. Lionel Carrow was dangerous. Not because he appeared violent indeed, he appeared remarkably civilized, but because he possessed control. And controlled people, Miss Marple knew, could become extraordinarily ruthless once threatened. Halfway down Hollow Lane she encountered Superintendent Pierce striding toward Ashcombe House. He stopped at once upon seeing her. "Miss Marple, visiting the Carrows?" Pierce frowned toward the house. "I've just come from Fletcher." "And?" "He insists Carrow was near the bonfire before the fete." Miss Marple nodded. The superintendent stared. "You knew?" "Mr. Fletcher mentioned it." "And you didn't think that worth reporting?" "My dear superintendent, young men under arrest frequently accuse respectable doctors." Pierce gave a grunt of irritation. "Carrow denies it, naturally." "Of course, but something about the fellow troubles me." Miss Marple looked interested. "Instinct? Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "Call it experience." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Experience is often another name for pattern recognition." The superintendent eyed her suspiciously. "You've formed a theory." "Not yet." That, unfortunately, was true, because several pieces still failed to fit. If Lionel Carrow had killed Gerald Finch, why hide the body in the bonfire? Why such theatricality? And why did Evelyn seem simultaneously terrified of her husband and determined to protect him? Number. Something remained hidden beneath the obvious story. Something older. Something connected to London, perhaps, or to the dead patient Evelyn had mentioned. As Pierce continued toward Ashcombe House, Miss Marple resumed her walk home through the damp afternoon mist. The hedges dripped steadily beside the lane, and from somewhere deep in the village came the distant sound of church bells striking 4. But another sound followed it, a cry. A woman's cry. It had come from Ashcombe House. Miss Marple stopped at once. The cry had been brief, muffled almost immediately, yet unmistakably distressed. She turned instinctively toward Ashcombe House. Through the drifting mist the dark shape of the house stood silent among the trees. No further sound emerged. Even the rain seemed suddenly subdued, hanging softly in the cold air. A moment later Superintendent Pierce appeared again at the front doorway, moving quickly now rather than with his previous deliberate stride. The front door opened wider. Dr. Carrow stepped out behind him. Both men looked tense, very tense. Miss Marple began walking back toward the house without haste but with firm determination. Elderly ladies moving briskly often alarmed people unnecessarily. As she approached the gravel drive, Pierce spotted her. "Miss Marple," he called sharply, "I think perhaps you should." But before he could finish, Evelyn Carrow appeared briefly at an upstairs window. Her face was white with terror. Then the curtain jerked closed violently from inside the room. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Pierce had seen it too. Without another word he strode into the house. Dr. Carrow remained in the doorway. "Perfectly all right," he said smoothly. "My wife has been rather overwrought." Miss Marple looked up at him. "Indeed?" "Yeah." The strain of recent events. He smiled, yet the hand resting against the door frame trembled ever so slightly. Miss Marple noticed. So, apparently, did Superintendent Pierce, because moments later his voice sounded sharply from inside the hall. "Carrow!" The doctor excused himself immediately and disappeared indoors. Miss Marple remained where she was. There were occasions, she knew, when entering a situation directly caused people to become guarded. Far better sometimes to appear peripheral. Invisible elderly ladies frequently saw the truth first. 5 minutes later the front door opened again. Pierce emerged looking 5 minutes later the front door opened again. Pierce emerged looking grave. "There's been an accident," he said curtly. Miss Marple said nothing. "Mrs. Carrow fell." "Fell?" "Down the back staircase." The explanation arrived too quickly. Miss Marple's expression did not alter. "How unfortunate." Pierce hesitated, then lowered his voice. "She's alive. Concussion, perhaps. Dr. Carrow insists it happened during a fainting spell." "And do you believe him?" The superintendent glanced uneasily toward the house. "I don't know what I believe." That, Miss Marple thought, was encouraging. Policemen became most dangerous and most effective once certainty abandoned them. "She cried out," Miss Marple observed quietly. Pierce gave her a sharp look. "You heard it?" A pause followed. Then the superintendent muttered, "So did I." They stood silently for a moment while rain drifted across the gravel drive in fine silver threads. At length Pierce said, "There's something damned odd here. I searched Finch's house this morning." Miss Marple waited. "No money, no blackmail letters, nothing obvious. That surprises you? It should have been there." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Unless someone removed it first." Pierce's face darkened. "Exactly." At that moment Dr. Carrow reappeared. His composure had returned completely. "One of the maids is staying with Evelyn," he explained calmly. "She'll recover after rest." Pierce regarded him steadily. "You're certain she simply fell?" "Quite certain." "And the argument the servants overheard beforehand?" For the briefest instant silence tightened across the doorway. Then Carrow shrugged lightly. "My wife has become nervous since the murder. She imagines dangers where none exist." Miss Marple saw Pierce watching him very closely now. Not openly suspicious, but no longer convinced. "Perhaps," Pierce said slowly, "I should speak with Mrs. Carrow directly tomorrow." "Of course." Too smooth again, too agreeable. Miss Marple reflected that truly innocent people often became indignant under suspicion. Lionel Carrow merely adapted, which was much more worrying. She took her leave soon afterward and walked home through the deepening dusk, but her thoughts remained fixed upon one particular detail. Evelyn Carrow had attempted to speak twice, and twice she had been interrupted. That evening Rosehill received fresh excitement. By supper-time rumors of Evelyn's accident had spread through the village with astonishing speed. Some said she had tried to throw herself downstairs. Others claimed she had discovered new evidence about Gerald Finch. Mrs. Elcott insisted dramatically that she had heard screams all afternoon. Miss Marple ignored most of it. Gossip, while useful, required careful filtering. Still, one thing troubled her profoundly. Not panic, not grief, but sustained fear over time. Evelyn Carrow behaved like a woman living beside constant danger, and Miss Marple had seen such women before. Late that night, as wind rattled softly against the cottage windows, she sat awake beside the fire reconstructing events carefully in her mind. Gerald Finch blackmailed someone. Tom Fletcher argued publicly with Finch and became the obvious suspect. Dr. Carrow was seen near the bonfire before the fete. Evelyn feared both the murder and her husband. Yet something still refused to settle properly. The bonfire itself. Why hide the body there at all? It was theatrical, deliberate, almost symbolic. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, and then suddenly she remembered something Evelyn had said. Some fires never truly go out. Miss Marple opened her eyes at once. Not a random remark, a reference to something older, some earlier scandal, perhaps something figuratively buried and now returned. Her thoughts moved swiftly then. The dead patient in London, the missing drugs, blackmail, and finally, Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed toward her writing desk. From an old leather case she removed several carefully bundled newspaper clippings collected over many years. Village ladies, people often forgot, read newspapers very attentively, especially elderly village ladies. She searched patiently for nearly 20 minutes, then stopped. One clipping had caught her eye. A small article from a London paper nearly 7 years earlier. The headline read, "Harley Street Physician Cleared After Clinic Fire." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read carefully. A private clinic in London had suffered a late-night fire. One patient had died. Questions had arisen regarding missing narcotics and irregular records, though no criminal charges were ultimately brought against the attending physician. Dr. Lionel Carrow. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A fire. And immediately another detail struck her. Records destroyed. Conveniently destroyed. She read the clipping twice more. Then she noticed something else. The dead patient had been a woman. Mrs. Adelaide Mercer, age 48. No surviving relatives. Miss Marple sat very still. Outside, wind whispered softly through the wet hedges, and somewhere deep beneath the quiet respectability of Ashcombe House, old ashes had begun stirring once more. The following morning dawned cold and brilliantly clear. After days of rain, Rosehill seemed washed pale beneath a sharp autumn sky. Frost silvered the hedges, and smoke rose cleanly from cottage chimneys into the still air. But beneath the village calm, tension had deepened. By now nearly everyone knew of Evelyn Carrow's fall. Speculation spread eagerly from doorstep to shop counter, embroidered with fresh details at every retelling. She tried to tell the police something. No, she fainted after receiving a letter. They say Dr. Carrow locked the room. Locked it himself, did he? Villages, Miss Marple often thought, possessed the remarkable ability to approach truth accidentally while gossiping about entirely the wrong things. She was considering this over breakfast when Florence entered carrying the Morning Post. "One for you from London, miss." Miss Marple looked up sharply. The envelope bore the neat official handwriting of Sir Henry Clithering. Sir Henry, former Commissioner of Scotland Yard, had long ago learned never to ignore one of Miss Marple's quiet inquiries. She opened the letter carefully. Inside was a short note and several typed pages. "My dear Miss Marple, I made discreet inquiries regarding Dr. Lionel Carrow as requested. You are correct that there was concern surrounding the clinic fire in Harley Street 7 years ago. Officially, no wrongdoing was proven. Unofficially, several matters caused unease among investigators. One nurse disappeared shortly after the incident and was never traced. Financial discrepancies were discovered but insufficiently documented. Most significantly, a former business associate of Carrow's later claimed records had vanished from the clinic before the fire spread. The matter quietly dissolved due to lack of evidence. Yours sincerely, Henry Clithering." Miss Marple reread the letter slowly. Then she turned to the attached pages. They contained summaries of old interviews and newspaper extracts. One paragraph in particular drew her attention immediately. Witnesses described Dr. Caro as unusually calm during the fire. One attendant later remarked that he seemed more concerned with securing his office than rescuing patients. Miss Marple folded the papers carefully. That sounded right. She had begun to understand Lionel Caro now. Not impulsive, not emotional. A man who prepared, which made Gerald Finch's death even more troubling. Because controlled men rarely committed flamboyant murders unless forced into desperation. At 11 o'clock, Superintendent Pierce arrived unexpectedly. He looked tired and irritable. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Superintendent." "Yes, thank you." He accepted the cup gratefully and remained standing beside the fire. "We've another complication." "That seldom improves matters." Pierce grimaced. "Mrs. Caro claims she slipped accidentally." Miss Marple was unsurprised. "And you don't believe her?" She was terrified. Pierce lowered his voice. "One of the maids heard shouting before the fall." Miss Marple waited. Apparently Caro kept demanding to know what Finch had told her. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "So now I've got a frightened wife protecting her husband and no evidence strong enough to move against him." He began pacing irritably. "And Fletcher's solicitor is demanding release because the case is becoming muddled." "Murder cases usually do become muddled once one approaches the truth," Miss Marple observed. Pierce stopped pacing. "You know something." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I know human nature, Superintendent." "Which means?" "It means Gerald Finch was almost certainly blackmailing Dr. Caro regarding the London clinic fire." Pierce stared at her. "How the devil?" "Old newspapers," said Miss Marple mildly. "People forget elderly women read them." She handed him Sir Henry's letter. Pierce read rapidly, his expression darkening. "Good God! But this still doesn't prove Caro killed Finch." "No." Miss Marple folded her hands. "However, it suggests motive." Pierce exhaled slowly. "There's more," he said after a moment. "Oh?" "We searched Finch's office again this morning." "And?" "We found traces of burnt paper in the grate." Miss Marple looked up immediately. "Burnt recently?" "Within the last few days." "How interesting." Pierce nodded grimly. "Someone destroyed documents after Finch died." "Or before." The superintendent frowned. "Yes." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "Tell me, how exactly was Gerald Finch killed?" Pierce blinked. "Blow to the head." "Only one?" "Immediate death?" "So the doctor believes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "One clean blow." Pierce looked at her sharply. "What are you thinking?" "That Gerald Finch probably knew his killer." The superintendent's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because surprise murders are usually clumsy." Miss Marple adjusted her knitting calmly. "Fear produces repeated violence. Panic. Disorder. But one controlled strike." Pierce finished the thought himself. "Which means Finch trusted the person standing near him." Pierce swore softly under his breath. By late afternoon another disturbing development unsettled Rosehill. Evelyn Caro had disappeared. The news spread rapidly through the village after one of the maids reported that Mrs. Caro's bedroom was empty and her bed unslept in. Dr. Caro himself appeared remarkably composed. According to the servants, he merely stated that his wife needed rest and had gone away temporarily. No one believed him. Superintendent Pierce arrived at Ashcombe House within the hour. Miss Marple, informed almost immediately by Mrs. Elcott's nephew, who delivered groceries to half the village, considered the matter gravely. A frightened woman did not vanish voluntarily while a murder investigation surrounded her husband. Not unless she feared something even worse. As dusk settled over Rosehill, Miss Marple wrapped herself warmly and walked toward Hollow Lane. The air had turned bitterly cold. Frost already crept across the grass beneath the hedges. Ashcombe House stood dark except for lights glowing downstairs. A police motor car waited near the gate. Miss Marple slowed slightly as she approached. Then she noticed something. Footprints. Small footprints leading away from the side garden gate toward the woods beyond the lane. Not fresh from this evening, perhaps, but recent enough. And hurried. Miss Marple followed them with her eyes toward the dark line of trees. Then she saw movement. Someone standing among the woods, watching the house. A woman. Even at a distance, Miss Marple recognized Evelyn Caro immediately. The younger woman looked pale and desperate beneath the bare branches. Her coat hung loosely about her shoulders, and her face carried the strained look of someone driven beyond exhaustion. Miss Marple moved quietly toward her. "My dear," she said softly. Evelyn started violently. Then relief flooded her expression. "Oh, Miss Marple, you should not be out here in this cold. I couldn't stay in the house." Her voice shook badly. "He knows." "Knows what?" Evelyn looked back toward Ashcombe House as though terrified someone might hear even through the trees. "He thinks Gerald told me everything before he died." "And did he?" For a moment Evelyn hesitated. Then she whispered. Miss Marple remained very still. "What did he tell you?" Evelyn's lips trembled. "That the woman in London didn't die in the fire." Miss Marple felt a sudden chill entirely unrelated to the weather. "What do you mean?" "She was already dead." Evelyn's voice had become barely audible. Before the fire started, silence settled heavily among the trees. Far off a church bell rang faintly through the evening mist. Then Evelyn said the words Miss Marple had already begun fearing. "Gerald Finch said my husband murdered her." For a long moment the woods seemed unnaturally still. Miss Marple could hear only the faint rustle of bare branches overhead, and Evelyn Carrow's uneven breathing in the cold evening air. Then she said quietly, "You had better tell me everything." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "I don't know very much," she whispered. "Only fragments. Lionel never discussed London willingly. Whenever I asked about the clinic fire he became angry. And Gerald Finch knew the truth?" "I think so." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "How long had he been blackmailing your husband?" The answer came immediately. "Since before we came to Rose Hill?" Evelyn wrapped her coat tightly around herself. "At first it was money. Then favors, introductions, investments." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Gerald always wanted more. And recently he threatened exposure." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That fit perfectly. Blackmailers almost always became greedy eventually. It was the floor upon which their profession inevitably collapsed." "What exactly did Finch claim happened in London?" Miss Marple asked. Evelyn hesitated visibly. "He said there was no accident at the clinic. And the woman Mrs. Mercer?" Evelyn stared toward the distant lights of Ashcombe House. She was wealthy, widowed, vulnerable. Her voice grew strained. "Lionel treated her privately for nerves. Gerald handled certain financial arrangements for the clinic." "Go on." "One night she died." Miss Marple waited. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Gerald told me Lionel administered something improper. Too much morphine, perhaps. Or another drug." She shook her head helplessly. "I don't know exactly." "And afterward?" The fire, the simplicity of the answer made it more terrible. Miss Marple felt suddenly very old and very cold. Controlled men, she thought again, preferred destruction that appeared accidental. Fire consumed records. Fire erased timings. Fire silenced questions. "What proof did Gerald Finch possess?" she asked quietly. "A ledger." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Yes," Evelyn whispered. "Gerald said he kept copies of clinic accounts, drug inventories, payments." She lowered her voice further. "And one entry proved Mrs. Mercer received medication after she was already dead." For the first time genuine horror entered Miss Marple's mind fully. Not merely negligence, then. Deliberate concealment. Perhaps murder. "Where is this ledger now?" she asked. Evelyn gave a frightened shake of her head. "I don't know." "Did Gerald mention it recently?" "He said he'd hidden it somewhere safe." Miss Marple's thoughts moved rapidly. If such a ledger existed, Lionel Carrow would certainly kill to recover it. Perhaps already had. And Gerald threatened to reveal everything. "When?" "The night before the fete." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Evelyn clasped her trembling hands together. "I heard them arguing in Lionel's study. Gerald kept saying it was time they settled matters permanently." "And your husband?" "He told Gerald he was becoming reckless." That sounded accurate, too. Reckless blackmailers endangered everyone. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. "My dear, why did Gerald tell you all this?" Evelyn looked suddenly exhausted. "Because he was frightened." That answer surprised Miss Marple. Frightened of Lionel. A gust of wind swept through the trees. Evelyn flinched visibly before continuing. "He said Lionel had changed recently. That something about Rose Hill made him nervous." She looked toward Miss Marple desperately. "Gerald believed Lionel intended to kill him. And did you warn him? Did he listen?" A faint, miserable smile touched Evelyn's mouth. "Gerald Finch never believed anyone capable of frightening him." "No," thought Miss Marple. "Men who live upon secrets rarely imagine themselves vulnerable until too late." Suddenly voices sounded faintly from the direction of the lane. Police officers. Evelyn stiffened immediately in panic. "He'll find me!" "My dear child, Superintendent Pierce is hardly dangerous. You don't understand," Evelyn whispered. "Lionel watches everything." Miss Marple considered quickly. "Come to my cottage." Evelyn stared. He'd never looked there first. After a moment's hesitation, the younger woman nodded. They moved carefully through the darkening lane together. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, warmth and lamplight created an almost unreal sense of safety after the freezing woods. Florence, though astonished by the late visitor, possessed too much breeding to ask questions aloud. Within minutes tea appeared beside the fire. Evelyn sat rigidly on the sofa, clutching the cup with both hands. Miss Marple observed her quietly. Fear had altered the woman profoundly over the past days. Beneath the elegance and composure now lay exhaustion bordering upon collapse. "How long have you been afraid of your husband?" Miss Marple asked gently. Evelyn looked down. "I don't know exactly. That usually means a very long time." The younger woman gave a faint shudder. "He wasn't always cruel." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Men rarely are at first." Evelyn stared into the fire. "After London, everything changed. Lionel became—" Her voice dropped. "Sometimes I think he stopped feeling things entirely." Miss Marple knitted quietly while listening. Human beings fascinated her endlessly, particularly the gradual transformations of character under pressure. "One can become accustomed to fear," Evelyn said suddenly. "That's the dreadful part. You begin arranging your life around another person's moods, their silences, their temper." Miss Marple nodded. "Like avoiding loose floorboards in a dark house." Evelyn looked at her in startled recognition. For several minutes only the fire crackled softly between them. Then Miss Marple asked, "When did Gerald Finch die?" Evelyn blinked. "The fair at night?" "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I mean when precisely?" Evelyn frowned, confused. "I don't understand." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Everyone assumes Gerald Finch was killed shortly before his body was discovered." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "But what if he died much earlier?" Evelyn stared at her. "The body was hidden inside the bonfire before evening. There would have been ample time." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Which means the murderer may have spent many hours arranging matters afterward." A slow realization entered Evelyn's face. "You think Lionel planned all of it?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that your husband dislikes improvisation." At that exact moment someone knocked sharply at the cottage door. Evelyn nearly dropped her teacup. Miss Marple rose calmly. Through the frosted glass she could already see the outline of Superintendent Pierce. She opened the door. The policeman removed his hat quickly. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple, but we're searching for Mrs. Carrow." "She is here," said Miss Marple. Pierce blinked. "She has been rather distressed." "I can imagine." He lowered his voice. "Carrow reported her missing an hour ago." "How responsible of him." Pierce gave her a long look. Then his eyes moved past her toward the sitting-room, and stopped, because Dr. Lionel Carrow stood just beyond the gate outside, watching the cottage. For a long moment the woods seemed unnaturally still. Miss Marple could hear only the faint rustle of bare branches overhead and Evelyn Carrow's uneven breathing in the cold evening air. Then she said quietly, "You had better tell me everything." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "I don't know very much," she whispered. "Only fragments. Lionel never discussed London willingly. Whenever I asked about the clinic fire he became angry. And Gerald Finch knew the truth?" "I think so." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "How long had he been blackmailing your husband?" The answer came immediately. "Since before we came to Rose Hill?" Evelyn wrapped her coat tightly around herself. "At first it was money, then favors, introductions, investments." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Gerald always wanted more." "And recently?" "He threatened exposure." Miss Marple nodded slowly. That fit perfectly. Blackmailers almost always became greedy eventually. It was the floor upon which their profession inevitably collapsed. "What exactly did Finch claim happened in London?" Miss Marple asked. Evelyn hesitated visibly. "He said there was no accident at the clinic." "And the woman Mrs. Mercer?" Evelyn stared toward the distant lights of Ashcombe House. She was wealthy, widowed, vulnerable. Her voice grew strained. "Lionel treated her privately for nerves. Gerald handled certain financial arrangements for the clinic." "Go on." "One night she died." Miss Marple waited. Evelyn swallowed hard. "Gerald told me Lionel administered something improper. Too much morphine, perhaps, or another drug." She shook her head helplessly. "I don't know exactly." "And afterward?"
The fire.
The simplicity of the answer made it more terrible. Miss Marple felt suddenly very old and very cold. Controlled men, she thought again, preferred destruction that appeared accidental. Fire consumed records. Fire erased timings. Fire silenced questions. What proof did Gerald Finch possess? She asked quietly. A ledger. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Yes, Evelyn whispered. Gerald said he kept copies of clinic accounts, drug inventories, payments. She lowered her voice further. And one entry proved Mrs. Mercer received medication after she was already dead. For the first time genuine horror entered Miss Marple's mind fully. Not merely negligence, then. Deliberate concealment. Perhaps murder. Where is this ledger now? She asked. Evelyn gave a frightened shake of her head.
I don't know.
Did Gerald mention it recently? He said he'd hidden it somewhere safe. Miss Marple's thoughts moved rapidly. If such a ledger existed, Lionel Carrow would certainly kill to recover it. Perhaps already had. And Gerald threatened to reveal everything?
When?
The night before the fete. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Evelyn clasped her trembling hands together. I heard them arguing in Lionel's study. Gerald kept saying it was time they settled matters permanently. And your husband? He told Gerald he was becoming reckless. That sounded accurate, too. Reckless blackmailers endangered everyone. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. My dear, why did Gerald tell you all this? Evelyn looked suddenly exhausted. Because he was frightened. That answer surprised Miss Marple. Frightened of Lionel. A gust of wind swept through the trees. Evelyn flinched visibly before continuing. He said Lionel had changed recently. That something about Rosehill made him nervous. She looked toward Miss Marple desperately. Gerald believed Lionel intended to kill him. And did you warn him? Did he listen? A faint, miserable smile touched Evelyn's mouth. Gerald Finch never believed anyone capable of frightening him. No, thought Miss Marple. Men who live upon secrets rarely imagine themselves vulnerable until too late. Suddenly voices sounded faintly from the direction of the lane. Police officers. Evelyn stiffened immediately in panic. He'll find me. My dear child, Superintendent Pierce is hardly dangerous. You don't understand, Evelyn whispered. Lionel watches everything. Miss Marple considered quickly. Come to my cottage. Evelyn stared. He'd never look there first. After a moment's hesitation, the younger woman nodded. They moved carefully through the darkening lane together. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, warmth and lamplight created an almost unreal sense of safety after the freezing woods. Florence, though astonished by the late visitor, possessed too much breeding to ask questions aloud. Within minutes tea appeared beside the fire. Evelyn sat rigidly on the sofa, clutching the cup with both hands. Miss Marple observed her quietly. Fear had altered the woman profoundly over the past days. Beneath the elegance and composure now lay exhaustion bordering upon collapse. How long have you been afraid of your husband? Miss Marple asked gently. Evelyn looked down. I don't know exactly. That usually means a very long time. The younger woman gave a faint shudder. He wasn't always cruel. No, said Miss Marple softly. Men rarely are at first. Evelyn stared into the fire. After London everything changed. Lionel became... Her voice dropped. Sometimes I think he stopped feeling things entirely. Miss Marple knitted quietly while listening. Human beings fascinated her endlessly, particularly the gradual transformations of character under pressure. One can become accustomed to fear, Evelyn said suddenly. That's the dreadful part. You begin arranging your life around another person's moods, their silences, their temper. Another person's moods, their silences, their temper. Miss Marple nodded. Like avoiding loose floorboards in a dark house, Evelyn looked at her in startled recognition. For several minutes only the fire crackled softly between them. Then Miss Marple asked, When did Gerald Finch die? Evelyn blinked. The fete night. No, said Miss Marple gently. I mean, when precisely? Evelyn frowned, confused. I don't understand. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Everyone assumes Gerald Finch was killed shortly before his body was discovered. Her eyes sharpened slightly. But what if he died much earlier? Evelyn stared at her. The body was hidden inside the bonfire before evening. There would have been ample time. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Which means the murderer may have spent many hours arranging matters afterward. A slow realization entered Evelyn's face. You think Lionel planned all of it? I think, said Miss Marple carefully, that your husband dislikes improvisation. At that exact moment someone knocked sharply at the cottage door. Evelyn nearly dropped her teacup. Miss Marple rose calmly. Through the frosted glass she could already see the outline of Superintendent Pierce. She opened the door. The policeman removed his hat quickly. "Sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple, but we're searching for Mrs. Carrow." "She is here," said Miss Marple. Pierce blinked. "She has been rather distressed." "I can imagine." He lowered his voice. "Carrow reported her missing an hour ago. How responsible of him." Pierce gave her a long look. Then his eyes moved past her toward the sitting-room, and stopped, because Dr. Lionel Carrow stood just beyond the gate outside, watching the cottage, and set it on fire. The alarm bell from the high street had begun ringing shortly after 2 in the morning. By half the village's account, flames had leapt 30 feet into the air. By the other half, heroic townspeople had barely escaped death rescuing ledgers and furniture through collapsing smoke. In reality, Gerald Finch's office above the solicitor's rooms had suffered a fierce but contained fire before the Malacombe Brigade extinguished it. Nevertheless, by breakfast the event had transformed Rosehill entirely. A second fire, and this one no accident. Miss Marple learned the news from Florence, who arrived breathless into the breakfast-room carrying both toast and scandal. "They say somebody poured paraffin all over the place, miss." "Do they indeed?" "And Superintendent Pierce was there before dawn." Miss Marple buttered her toast thoughtfully. "Yes," she said quietly, "I imagine he would be, because now the pattern had become impossible to ignore. First the clinic fire in London, then Gerald Finch burned inside the bonfire. Now Finch's office set alight after police searches. Fire again, always fire, not rage, erasure. At 10 o'clock Superintendent Pierce arrived looking exhausted and furious. "Morning, Miss Marple." "My dear Superintendent, you appear overworked. I appear homicidal." He accepted tea gratefully and sank into a chair. "The office was deliberately torched. Someone broke in through the rear window after midnight." "And destroyed papers?" Pierce gave a short, bitter laugh. "Destroyed everything." Miss Marple watched him quietly. "No," she said after a moment. "Not everything." The superintendent looked up sharply. "Meaning?" "If the intruder believes something remained there, he may have searched first." Pierce blinked. Then comprehension spread across his face. "You think he was looking for the ledger, and burned the office afterward to cover it, or from frustration at not finding it?" Pierce swore softly under his breath. "We found drawers pulled out, cabinets overturned." He frowned heavily. "At first I assumed ordinary fire damage, but now? Now I'm beginning to think our arsonist was searching desperately." Miss Marple nodded. "Which suggests the ledger still exists." Pierce stared at her. "Unless Carrow already found it." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "If he had, there would be no need for another fire." The superintendent sat very still. Outside, church bells drifted faintly across the cold morning air. Finally Pierce said, "We searched the bonfire ashes again." "And?" His face darkened. "We found fragments of paper." Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "Accounting paper, charred edges, most unreadable." He reached into his coat and produced a small evidence envelope. "Except for one line." Carefully he unfolded a blackened scrap. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The surviving words were faint but legible. "Mercer dosage amended after." The sentence ended in burned ruin. Yet it was enough. Miss Marple looked up slowly. "Yes," she said. Pierce leaned forward. "Carrow claims it proves nothing. Of course he does. But Finch clearly had clinic records, and someone tried very hard to destroy them." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then the question becomes, where is the rest?" Pierce rubbed his jaw tiredly. "We searched Finch's house again. Nothing. Office destroyed. No safe deposit boxes. No hidden compartments." He looked irritated. "The man lived like a ferret." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Blackmailers often do." A silence followed. Then Pierce asked abruptly, "What do you really think happened in London?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "I think Mrs. Mercer probably died from improper medication." "Accidentally?" "Possibly at first." Pierce frowned. "But—" Miss Marple's eyes remained thoughtful. "Suppose Dr. Carrow realized afterward that negligence would ruin him. Suppose records existed proving drug misuse." She paused. "A fire then becomes terribly convenient." Pierce nodded slowly. "And Finch helped cover it up, in exchange for leverage later." "Precisely." The superintendent exhaled sharply. Human weakness, Miss Marple reflected, was remarkably economical. One sin frequently generated 3 or 4 others quite naturally. At that moment Florence entered. "There's a gentleman asking for Superintendent Pierce." Pierce looked annoyed.
He wouldn't give a name.
Miss Marple noticed something immediately in Florence's expression. "Show him in," Pierce said. A moment later the visitor entered, Tom Fletcher. The young man looked exhausted, unshaven, and deeply anxious. Pierce stiffened. "What are you doing here?" "They released me," Tom said hoarsely. "This morning," the superintendent grunted. "Yes, temporarily." Tom looked toward Miss Marple almost apologetically. "I remembered something." Pierce's attention sharpened instantly.
"Why?"
Tom swallowed hard. "The night before the fete, I saw Finch arguing with somebody near the old quarry road."
"Caro?"
"No." Tom hesitated. "A woman." Miss Marple sat very still. "Who?" Pierce demanded. "I couldn't see clearly at first." Tom rubbed his forehead nervously. "But afterward I realized it was Mrs. Caro." Miss Marple's thoughts shifted rapidly. "What were they arguing about?" she asked gently. Tom looked uncertain. "I only caught bits. Finch kept saying something like, 'He'll destroy you too.'" Pierce frowned deeply. "And Mrs. Caro?" "She told him to leave Rosehill." Silence settled briefly. Then Tom added quietly, "And Finch laughed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. That sounded exactly right. Men like Gerald Finch enjoyed fear in others. "Did you tell anyone this before?" Pierce asked sharply. Tom shook his head. "I thought it would make things worse for her." Pierce leaned back slowly. "Perhaps it already has." After Tom departed, Miss Marple remained thoughtful for a long time. One detail troubled her enormously now. If Evelyn feared her husband, why meet Gerald Finch privately at all? Miss Marple's mind stopped suddenly upon the thought. Unless Evelyn herself had been searching for the ledger. She rose abruptly and crossed toward the window. Outside, Rose Hill moved quietly through its ordinary routines beneath pale winter sunlight. Deliveries arrived at shops. Children crossed the green. Smoke drifted peacefully upward from chimneys. Yet beneath it all, the village had become a battlefield of hidden knowledge, and somewhere among them walked a man who solved danger by burning it away. Miss Marple turned back slowly. "Superintendent," she said. Pierce looked up. "Did anyone ever identify the missing nurse from the London clinic?" He frowned. "Why?" Miss Marple's gaze had become very distant indeed. "Because I am beginning to wonder," she said softly, "whether Gerald Finch was truly the only person who knew the truth." That afternoon Miss Marple travelled to Marlicombe by bus. The journey took nearly 40 minutes owing to damp roads, an argumentative sheep near the lower crossing, and Mrs. Elcott insisting upon discussing murder loudly with every passenger regardless of interest. Miss Marple listened politely while appearing not to. In reality her thoughts remained fixed upon one idea. Missing people rarely vanished entirely, particularly women. A woman alone might change employment, appearance, even name, but habits persisted. Connections persisted. Human beings always left traces of themselves behind in other people's memories, and nurses, Miss Marple reflected, formed especially memorable impressions. Marlicombe General Hospital stood on a hill overlooking the town, a square brick building smelling faintly of polish, starch, and boiled vegetables. Miss Marple had telephoned ahead, which was why Matron Ellery received her with cautious courtesy in a tidy office overlooking the courtyard. "You're a friend of Sir Henry Clithering's?" the matron asked. That simplified matters enormously. Ellery folded capable hands upon her desk. "You're inquiring about a nurse from London?" "Yes, 7 years ago." The matron frowned thoughtfully. "There was some unpleasantness connected with that clinic fire, if I remember correctly." "Indeed. The nurse disappeared afterward?" "So I understand." Matron Ellery rose and crossed toward a filing cabinet. "Nurses do disappear occasionally," she said dryly. "Usually because they marry unsuitable men." Miss Marple smiled faintly. After several minutes of searching, the matron withdrew an old personnel register. "Here we are. Nurse Edith Lawson." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Lawson?" "Yes. Worked briefly here about 8 years ago under temporary references." Matron Ellery adjusted her spectacles. "Left suddenly after only 3 months. Did she mention London?" "A little." "Do you remember her?" The matron hesitated. "Yes," she admitted at last, "because she was frightened." Miss Marple became very still. "Frightened of what?" She never said directly, but she disliked men asking questions. "And once—" The matron paused. "Yes?" "She saw a newspaper photograph unexpectedly and became extremely distressed." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "A photograph of whom?" "Dr. Caro." Silence settled across the office. Outside, a trolley rattled faintly down the corridor. "And afterward?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Matron Ellery returned to the file. "She resigned within the week." "Did she leave an address?" "A forwarding address in Kent." The matron frowned, though whether it was genuine I couldn't say. Miss Marple copied it carefully into her notebook. Then another thought struck her. "Did Nurse Lawson ever speak of Gerald Finch?" The matron looked surprised. "No, although there was a gentleman who visited her once." Miss Marple's pulse quickened slightly. "Yes? He upset her badly. Can you describe him?" "Large fellow, loud voice, expensive coat." Matron Ellery frowned in recollection. "Rather unpleasant. Gerald Finch." Miss Marple was now almost certain. She thanked the matron warmly and departed. By the time she returned to Rosehill, dusk had already begun settling over the village. Smoke drifted low across the rooftops, and lamps glowed softly behind curtained windows. Yet the moment she stepped from the bus she sensed something was wrong. People were gathered outside the Bluebell Café, talking in low, excited voices. Mrs. Elcott spotted Miss Marple immediately. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard?" "Heard what?" "It's Mrs. Carrow." Miss Marple felt sudden cold along her spine. "What about her?" "She's disappeared again." Within minutes Miss Marple learned the details. Evelyn had vanished from the cottage shortly after luncheon while Florence briefly visited the grocer's. No note, no luggage missing, nothing. Superintendent Pierce had already begun searching the village. Miss Marple listened gravely. Number. This felt wrong. Evelyn had been frightened before, yes, but not irrational. She would not simply wander off alone while Lionel Carrow remained under suspicion. Miss Marple stopped abruptly in the lane, unless someone had summoned her. At that moment Superintendent Pierce approached from the church path looking furious. "You should never have left her alone," he snapped immediately. "My dear Superintendent, I am 90 years old, not Scotland Yard." Pierce exhaled irritably. "Sorry. Any sign of her?" "No." He lowered his voice. "But we found this." From his pocket he produced a folded note. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The message was brief. "If you want the truth about London, come alone." "Yef." Miss Marple stared at the initials. Evelyn Finch. Number. Evelyn Carrow. Someone wanted her to think Gerald Finch had left information hidden somewhere. Pierce spoke grimly. "We found it in your cottage sitting room." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "In my cottage?" Very interesting indeed, because that meant the note had likely been delivered while Florence was absent, and only someone familiar with village routines would risk such timing. "Where was Mrs. Carrow last seen?" Miss Marple asked. "Walking toward Hollow Lane." Of course. Everything returned eventually to Hollow Lane. Mist had already begun gathering there now as evening deepened. The hedges loomed dark against the fading sky, and the woods beyond Ashcombe House seemed unnaturally silent. Pierce turned to two constables. "Search the quarry road again." The quarry. Miss Marple's thoughts moved suddenly and swiftly. Gerald Finch had argued there with Evelyn. It lay secluded, unused, and connected to old storage tunnels from the quarry days. She looked at Pierce immediately. "The old lime sheds." The superintendent blinked. "What?" "Near the quarry. They were used for storage years ago." Pierce swore softly. "Good God!" Without another word he turned sharply toward the lane. They reached the quarry road 10 minutes later. The place looked desolate in the gathering darkness. Broken fencing sagged beside weed-covered stone pits, and frost silvered the ground beneath the trees. Then one constable shouted. Pierce ran forward. Miss Marple followed more slowly. Near the old lime shed, half hidden among dead leaves, lay Evelyn Carrow's scarf, and the shed door stood slightly open. Pierce drew his torch immediately and stepped inside. For one terrible instant nobody spoke. Then his voice came sharply from within. "She's here!" Miss Marple entered carefully behind him. The air smelled damp and bitter with old stone dust. Evelyn sat slumped against the wall, pale and trembling violently, but alive. Beside her on the floor lay a leather-bound ledger, and standing over it calmly, revolver in hand, was Dr. Lionel Carrow. For one suspended moment nobody moved. The torchlight struck sharply across the cramped stone shed. Evelyn huddled against the wall, white-faced and exhausted, the black leather ledger lying beside her on the floor, and Lionel Carrow standing perfectly still with the revolver held low in one hand. He looked remarkably calm. That, Miss Marple thought at once, was the truly dangerous thing. Superintendent Pierce froze in the doorway. "Put the gun down, Carrow." Lionel smiled faintly. "I don't think so." His voice remained courteous, almost conversational, yet the revolver did not waver. Evelyn looked toward Miss Marple desperately. "He followed me," she whispered. "I found the ledger hidden here this afternoon, and he came after me. Quiet, Evelyn. Not loudly, not violently, but with absolute authority." Miss Marple observed him carefully. Men like Lionel Carrow rarely shouted once control began slipping. Instead, they became colder, more precise. Pierce shifted slightly. "Think carefully." "Oh, I am," Carrow replied. "Much more carefully than anyone else involved in this absurd affair." The torchlight gleamed against damp stone walls. Outside, wind whispered through the trees. Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly toward the ledger. Gerald Finch had hidden it away after all. And somewhere within those pages lay the truth Lionel Carrow feared more than murder charges. "You can't escape this now," Pierce said steadily. "No?" Carrow glanced down almost thoughtfully at the ledger. "You still haven't understood what happened." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "Then perhaps you should explain it." His eyes shifted toward her. For the first time since entering the shed, Miss Marple saw genuine irritation cross his face. Not fear, not panic, annoyance, because she had understood too much. "You've been meddling from the beginning," he said mildly. "A dangerous hobby." "Not nearly so dangerous as blackmail," Miss Marple replied. A faint smile touched his mouth. Gerald certainly proved that. Pierce took another careful step forward. "Stay where you are." The revolver lifted slightly. Evelyn gave a frightened gasp. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Then she said quietly, "You killed Gerald Finch because he intended to expose London." Carrow looked at her almost approvingly. "Partly." "Partly?" The answer surprised even Pierce. Carrow's expression remained composed. "You all insist upon imagining melodramatic motives. Revenge, fear, passion." He shook his head faintly. The reality was much simpler. No one spoke. Then Carrow continued calmly. "Gerald became greedy. Worse than greedy, careless." His mouth tightened slightly. He began drinking too much, threatening people openly, hinting at things. "The ledger," said Miss Marple. He glanced toward it with undisguised contempt. "A vulgar little insurance policy." Pierce's voice hardened. "So you murdered him." Lionel sighed softly. "I intended only to retrieve the ledger." Miss Marple watched him closely. "And Gerald refused." Gerald attempted negotiation. A bitter amusement entered his face. He always believed himself cleverer than everyone else. And then, for the first time, Lionel Carrow hesitated. Only briefly. But enough. "We argued near the bonfire before the fete began. Tom Fletcher had been right. Gerald threatened exposure again. He said Evelyn already suspected the truth." His eyes flicked coldly toward his wife, which complicated matters. Evelyn shrank visibly. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "So you killed him?"
"No."
That answer altered the entire atmosphere in the shed. Pierce frowned sharply.
"Why?"
Carrow looked almost tired now. "I struck him, yes. He fell." His gaze drifted briefly downward. "But he was alive when I left him." Then Evelyn whispered, "You're lying." "No." Pierce's voice turned dangerous. "You expect us to believe someone else finished the job?" Carrow gave a short laugh. "You policemen do so love tidy narratives." Miss Marple's mind had already begun moving rapidly again. One clean blow. Body hidden later. Fire afterward. Her thoughts halted abruptly. "Who found him afterward?" she asked quietly. Carrow looked at her, and suddenly smiled. Not pleasantly, triumphantly. "Ah," he said softly. "There you are." Pierce glanced sharply between them. "What does that mean?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because she had seen it now, the missing piece. The flaw that had troubled her from the beginning. Tom Fletcher lacked subtlety. Lionel Carrow possessed too much control. But Gerald Finch's death itself, the concealment inside the bonfire, the theatrical cruelty of it contained something else entirely. Something emotional. Someone afraid. "Oh dear," said Miss Marple quietly. Pierce stared at her. "Why?" Miss Marple looked toward Evelyn. The younger woman had gone utterly white. "No," Evelyn whispered immediately. "No." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I think you had better tell us the truth." Evelyn began shaking violently. Carrow watched her with detached calm, almost curiosity. Pierce looked bewildered. "What truth?" Miss Marple folded her hands carefully. "Doctor, Carrow struck Gerald Finch during their quarrel. Then he left him alive." She paused. "And afterward someone else found Gerald Finch near the bonfire. Pierce stared at Evelyn. "No." Tears spilled suddenly down Evelyn's face. "He said Lionel would destroy me too," she whispered. The words emerged brokenly now. "He laughed at me." Miss Marple's heart tightened painfully. Years of fear, years of humiliation and control, and finally Gerald Finch threatening exposure while mocking her helplessness. Pierce spoke slowly. "You killed Finch?" Evelyn covered her face. "I didn't mean to." Caro gave a soft exhalation, almost relief. Miss Marple understood immediately. Lionel had realized the truth afterward, and protected Evelyn not from love perhaps, but from scandal and collapse that would expose London as well. "My dear child," Miss Marple said softly. Evelyn's voice shook uncontrollably. "He was injured but alive. He kept talking about Lionel—" She sobbed once. "And then he grabbed me." No one interrupted. "I struck him with the poker." Her face twisted in horror. "Only once." Pierce looked stunned. "And afterward?" Evelyn stared blankly toward the ledger. "Lionel found me there." At last the final shape emerged. Miss Marple saw it clearly now. Lionel Caro had not planned Gerald Finch's murder. Only intimidation, perhaps recovery of the ledger. But when he discovered Finch dead and Evelyn responsible, he had done what controlled men always did. He managed the situation, the body hidden inside the bonfire, evidence arranged, Tom Fletcher positioned conveniently as suspect, and afterward fire after fire after fire, all to erase the ledger and bury London forever. Pierce turned slowly toward Caro. "You concealed the murder, and attempted further arson. You threatened witnesses." A faint shrug. "Necessity." Pierce's face hardened completely now. "You damned cold-blooded devil." Lionel Caro smiled faintly. "No, Superintendent." He glanced toward Evelyn almost thoughtfully. "Quite the opposite, really." Then, before anyone fully realized his intention, he raised the revolver sharply toward himself. Evelyn screamed. The gunshot exploded through the stone shed like thunder. For several seconds after the gunshot, nobody moved. The sound seemed to linger unnaturally within the narrow stone shed, echoing against damp walls before dissolving slowly into silence. Then Evelyn cried out again. Superintendent Pierce lunged forward instinctively, wrenching the revolver from Lionel Caro's hand as the doctor collapsed heavily sideways against the stone floor. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Not dead. She saw that immediately. The shot had passed through the shoulder. Blood darkened Caro's coat rapidly, but his breathing remained shallow and uneven. Pierce knelt beside him with grim efficiency. "Get the village doctor," he snapped toward the constable at the doorway. "Now." The constable vanished into the night at once. Evelyn remained pressed against the wall, trembling violently, staring at her husband as though unable to comprehend what had happened. Miss Marple crossed quietly to her side. "It's over now," she said gently, but Evelyn shook her head faintly. "No," she whispered. "No." And Miss Marple knew she was right, because endings were rarely clean, particularly when fear had lasted years. Outside, cold wind moved softly through the quarry trees. Somewhere distant, church bells marked the quarter hour with absurd calm. Within 20 minutes, the shed had filled with policemen, blankets, lanterns, and confusion. Lionel Caro was carried out unconscious beneath heavy coats. Evelyn, pale as paper, gave her statement in broken fragments while Superintendent Pierce listened in weary silence. The ledger lay upon the rough wooden table at the center of the shed. Miss Marple watched Pierce open it carefully. Page after page contained copied clinic records, financial notes, drug inventories, and letters, all meticulously preserved by Gerald Finch over the years. Insurance indeed. One loose paper slipped free as Pierce turned the pages. He picked it up. His expression changed immediately. "What is it?" Miss Marple asked softly. Pierce handed her the sheet. It was a typed statement signed years earlier by Nurse Edith Lawson. A witness account, brief but devastating. "I observed Dr. Caro entering Mrs. Mercer's room after her death had already been confirmed. Later, clinic records were altered. Mr. Finch instructed me to remain silent for my own protection." Miss Marple folded the page slowly. There it was. Not proof of deliberate murder, perhaps, but proof of concealment. And now finally, after 7 years, truth. Evelyn saw the document and closed her eyes. "He told me none of it mattered any more," she whispered. "That the past was finished." Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "The past is very seldom finished. No one understood that better than elderly ladies." By dawn the following morning Rose Hill knew nearly everything. Not accurately, naturally, but enthusiastically. The village awoke to a frenzy of speculation so intense that Mrs. Elcott claimed she had scarcely slept from moral shock, though Miss Marple privately suspected excitement played the larger role. The Bluebell Café overflowed by 9 o'clock. Some insisted Lionel Caro had confessed fully before collapsing. Others believed Evelyn innocent entirely. One particularly dramatic theory involved international narcotics trafficking and secret wartime espionage. Villagers improved stories instinctively. Miss Marple avoided most of it. She sat quietly beside her sitting-room fire while frost whitened the garden outside. The events of the previous night had left her unusually tired, not physically, emotionally, because Evelyn Caro's face remained in her thoughts. People imagined murder sprang from wickedness alone, but often Miss Marple knew it emerged from accumulated fear, years of pressure and helplessness finally bursting through some fragile human boundary. That did not excuse it, but it explained it. Shortly after noon, Superintendent Pierce arrived. He looked as though he had not slept. "Well," he said heavily, lowering himself into a chair, "you were right." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Superintendent, one should never say that too loudly. Policemen dislike it." Pierce snorted despite himself. Caro survived. "Yes?" Bullet passed clean through the shoulder. He rubbed his face tiredly. "He'll stand trial." "And Mrs. Caro?" Pierce hesitated. "That's more complicated." Miss Marple nodded slowly. It would be. Evelyn had killed Gerald Finch, but not with planning, not from greed, not even truly from hatred. Humiliation, desperation. English juries, Miss Marple thought, could be unpredictable where frightened women were concerned. "She's confessed fully," Pierce continued. "Caro admitted concealing the body afterward and arranging evidence against Fletcher. And the fires? All him." Pierce's mouth tightened. "He burned Finch's office, searching for the ledger after realizing it was missing." Miss Marple looked toward the window thoughtfully. "Always fire." Pierce shook his head. "Destroy records, destroy evidence, destroy witnesses if necessary." He exhaled grimly. The man spent years trying to burn away consequences. "But consequences," said Miss Marple softly, "are remarkably fireproof." The superintendent looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled tiredly. "You know," he said, "I almost arrested Fletcher permanently. And if you hadn't interfered—" "My dear Superintendent," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "I merely knitted and asked inconvenient questions." Pierce laughed unexpectedly. "That's what frightens me." After he left, Miss Marple remained by the fire for some time thinking quietly. Outside, Rose Hill had already begun healing itself in the peculiar village fashion. Shops reopened. Children returned to games on the green. Conversation slowly drifted toward weather, parish disputes, and Mrs. Dalrymple's ongoing quarrel with the church committee. Life persisted. It always did. Yet certain scars remained invisible beneath ordinary routines. Tom Fletcher would forever remember the terror of being accused. Evelyn Caro would carry years of fear long after trials ended. And somewhere in London, forgotten records and burnt walls would finally surrender truths buried beneath ash for nearly a decade. That evening Miss Marple walked briefly through the village. The remains of the bonfire had long since been cleared away from the green. Only a blackened circle upon the frosted grass remained. She paused there quietly. Fire fascinated people, she reflected. They imagined it cleansing, purifying. But fire merely transformed things. Truth survived in stranger forms. A scrap of paper, a frightened memory, a sentence spoken carelessly years before, or simply the uneasy feeling that human nature had repeated itself once again. Miss Marple turned toward home as dusk gathered softly over Rose Hill. Behind curtained windows lamps glowed warmly against the cold. The village looked peaceful once more. And yet, as always, Miss Jane Marple knew how thin the surface of peace truly was. By January the frost had settled permanently across the countryside. Rose Hill moved through winter with muted determination. Chimney smoke hanging low over rooftops, muddy boots lined beside cottage doors, and villagers wrapped heavily in scarves while discussing the coming trial with endless fascination. For the trial, naturally, had become the most important event the village had experienced in years, not merely because of murder, but because it involved matters Rose Hill found deeply irresistible: scandal, respectability, hidden sins, and the dramatic collapse of a handsome outsider. Miss Marple observed the excitement with quiet resignation. Human beings, she reflected, preferred tragedy at a comfortable distance. The Malekuma assizes opened on a bleak Monday morning beneath a sky the color of old wool. Miss Marple attended only because Superintendent Pierce insisted. "Your testimony is essential," he had declared, which was unfortunate because Miss Marple disliked courtrooms intensely. They possessed none of the subtlety of real life. Everything became simplified into opposing narratives, whereas human motives usually tangled together untidily. Still she went. The courthouse was crowded long before proceedings began. Reporters from London sat beside local villagers straining eagerly for glimpses of the accused. Evelyn Carrow entered first. A murmur passed through the courtroom immediately. She looked terribly altered. The elegant composure she once carried had vanished entirely. She appeared thin, exhausted, and older somehow, not in face alone, but in spirit. Miss Marple felt a sudden ache of pity. Lionel Carrow followed under police escort. His wounded shoulder forced a stiffness into his posture, yet his expression remained calm and controlled. Too controlled. Even now. He glanced once across the courtroom toward Evelyn. She lowered her eyes immediately. The old habits persisted. Miss Marple noticed Superintendent Pierce observing the exchange grimly from the prosecution table. The charges had finally settled into clear form. Evelyn Carrow manslaughter and the death of Gerald Finch. Lionel Carrow conspiracy to obstruct justice, destruction of evidence, attempted arson, and intimidation of witnesses. The London matters complicated everything further. Though no murder charge regarding Mrs. Mercer could now be fully proved, the clinic records and Nurse Lawson's statement painted a devastating portrait of corruption and concealment. Over 3 long days the story unfolded publicly. Gerald Finch's blackmail, the Harley Street fire, the hidden ledger, and finally the terrible evening beside the bonfire. Miss Marple listened quietly from the back row. The prosecution portrayed Lionel Carrow as manipulative, cold, and morally corrupt, which was true. The defense portrayed Evelyn as frightened, psychologically dominated, and driven beyond endurance, which was also true. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, frequently proved inconveniently divisible. When Evelyn finally entered the witness box, the courtroom became utterly silent. Her hands trembled visibly as she spoke. At first her voice scarcely rose above a whisper, but gradually, painfully, the years emerged. The isolation, Lionel's careful control, the endless pressure. The isolation, Lionel's careful control, the endless pressure of living beside a man who monitored every expression, every friendship, every uncertainty. Miss Marple watched the jurors closely. Several women looked visibly shaken. One elderly man removed his spectacles and polished them repeatedly while staring downward. Then came the hardest moment. The prosecutor asked quietly, "Mrs. Carrow, did you intend to kill Gerald Finch?" Evelyn closed her eyes.
"No."
"Then why strike him?" The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward unconsciously. Finally Evelyn whispered, "Because he laughed." Such a small answer, yet Miss Marple understood it completely. Years of humiliation sometimes gathered around one final unbearable moment. Gerald Finch had mocked her fear, and everything collapsed at once. Later Lionel Carrow testified. He remained polished and articulate throughout, though increasingly strained under questioning regarding the clinic fire and subsequent concealments. At one point the prosecutor asked, "Why did you place the body inside the bonfire?" Lionel hesitated only briefly. "To delay discovery." "And to implicate Tom Fletcher?" A faint pause. No remorse, simply acknowledgment. Miss Marple felt again that peculiar chill controlled people inspired in her, not because they lacked emotion entirely, but because they valued order above conscience. On the 4th afternoon the verdicts arrived. Evelyn Carrow, guilty of manslaughter with strong recommendation for mercy. Lionel Carrow, guilty on all charges. A long exhalation seemed to pass through the courtroom collectively. Evelyn wept silently. Lionel Carrow did not react at all. The judge, an elderly man with tired eyes, spoke at length before sentencing. Of Lionel Carrow, he said, "You treated truth as something to be managed rather than honored." Miss Marple thought that remarkably accurate. Evelyn received a suspended sentence owing to exceptional circumstances and medical testimony regarding prolonged psychological abuse. Lionel Carrow received several years' imprisonment, not enough perhaps for all the harm done, but enough to end the careful, respectable life he had built upon ashes. As the courtroom emptied slowly afterward, Superintendent Pierce approached Miss Marple. "Well," he said heavily, "that's finished." Miss Marple looked toward Evelyn, being led quietly away by a policewoman. "No," she said softly, "only concluded." Pierce frowned slightly. There's a difference?
Oh, yeah.
Outside, snow had begun falling lightly across Marleycombe. The world looked pale and strangely quiet beneath it. Reporters clustered near the courthouse steps shouting questions, while villagers whispered excitedly in little groups. Miss Marple descended the steps carefully. Tom Fletcher waited near the gate. He removed his cap awkwardly when he saw her. "Miss Marple." "My dear Mr. Fletcher." He looked embarrassed. "I wanted to thank you. There's no need." "Yes, there is." He hesitated. "If it hadn't been for you." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear boy, villages are full of innocent young men accused of things they haven't done. One simply learns to notice patterns." Tom laughed faintly. Then his expression grew serious. "Do you think Mrs. Carrow's wicked?" Miss Marple considered before answering.
"No."
"But she killed someone." Snow drifted softly between them. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands together. "Human beings are rarely divided neatly into wicked and innocent," she said quietly. "Most people are merely frightened, or weak, or lonely." Tom looked thoughtful. "And Dr. Carrow?" Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the gray winter sky. "Dr. Carrow," she said after a moment, "made the terrible mistake of believing intelligence exempted him from morality." Tom frowned slightly as though trying to understand. Miss Marple smiled. "It's surprisingly common." They parted at the station shortly afterward, and as the train carried her back toward Rose Hill through fields whitened with snow, Miss Marple sat quietly watching smoke drift upward from distant cottages. Always smoke, always ashes afterward. But beneath even the darkest ruins truth persisted stubbornly, waiting patiently for someone to notice what others preferred to ignore. Winter loosened its grip slowly over Rose Hill. By March the hedges showed faint green shoots again, and the village resumed its ordinary rhythms with determined enthusiasm. The Bluebell Cafe reopened its garden tables. Mrs. Dalrymple resumed arguments about church repairs. Children once more crossed the green chasing hoops beneath pale spring sunlight. Outwardly, life had returned to normal. Villages excelled at that. Yet certain subjects lingered just beneath conversation like embers beneath ash. People still lowered their voices passing Hollow Lane. Ashcombe House remained shuttered and empty, and no bonfire was planned for the coming autumn fete. Miss Marple noticed all of it quietly. One afternoon she sat in her garden trimming dead winter stems while Mrs. Bantry leaned comfortably beside the tea-table discussing the aftermath of the trial with great satisfaction. "Well," Dolly declared, "I still say Lionel Carrow was one of the coldest men I've ever met." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "And poor Evelyn." Mrs. Bantry sighed heavily. "One cannot help pitying her."
"No."
Dolly stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Do you know what troubles me most?"
"What, dear?"
"She stayed with him for years." Miss Marple clipped another stem carefully before answering. "That is not unusual." Mrs. Bantry looked surprised. "My dear Jane, surely most women would leave eventually." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Dolly, people imagine fear dramatic because novels describe it dramatically." She set aside the shears. "But real fear is often extremely quiet." Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly. "I don't quite understand." "It accumulates," said Miss Marple softly. "Little by little. One adjusts oneself to avoid unpleasantness, then adjusts again. And after many years one scarcely notices how small one's life has become." Dolly looked unusually thoughtful. "That's rather dreadful." For a while only birdsong and the soft clink of teacups disturbed the afternoon stillness. Then Mrs. Bantry said suddenly, "And yet you knew from the beginning something was wrong." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, no. Not from the beginning, but very early." "Yes," Miss Marple admitted. "What first made you suspicious?" Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair. "The fear." "Evelyn's?" She looked toward the spring garden thoughtfully. "People often mistake fear for guilt. In fact, they can look remarkably alike." Her knitting rested quietly in her lap. "But frightened people watch doors. Guilty people watch faces." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Good heavens! And Lionel Carrow," Miss Marple continued gently, "watched faces constantly." The older woman shivered faintly despite the sunshine. "I still can't understand how anyone could hide a body inside a bonfire." Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. "Because once Lionel realized Gerald Finch was dead, everything became practical to him. The body hidden, the evidence arranged, the fires afterward." Miss Marple nodded. "He spent years believing problems could be destroyed if one burned the right things." For a moment neither spoke. Then Mrs. Bantry sighed. "Well, Rosehill will certainly gossip about this for the next 20 years. "My dear Dally," said Miss Marple dryly, "only 20?" That evening Miss Marple walked alone through the village. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and early blossoms. Lamps glowed warmly behind cottage curtains as dusk settled softly over Rosehill. She passed the village green slowly. The blackened patch from the bonfire had long since disappeared beneath fresh grass. Only memory remained now. Yet memory, Miss Marple knew, possessed remarkable persistence. At the church gate she encountered Superintendent Pierce. He looked considerably more rested than during the winter. "Evening, Miss Marple." "Good evening, Superintendent." Pierce glanced toward the green. "Hard to believe all that happened here." He hesitated briefly. "I received a letter from Caro yesterday." Miss Marple looked up. "Oh?" "He requested certain books from London." Pierce grimaced faintly. "Medical journals." "That sounds like him." The superintendent shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "You know, he still insists he never meant Finch to die." Miss Marple considered. "He may even believe it." Pierce frowned. "You think so?" "Yes." She looked quietly across the darkening village. Controlled people often divide responsibility very conveniently in their minds. Pierce gave a short laugh. "That's an elegant way of calling someone monstrous." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear superintendent, truly monstrous people are rarely elegant at all. That is what makes them easier to recognize." The church bell rang softly overhead. Pierce glanced toward her. "There's one thing I never asked." "Yes?" "Why did you call it the fire that refused to die?" Miss Marple's expression softened slightly. "Because it never truly was about the bonfire." The superintendent waited. Miss Marple folded her hands atop her walking-stick. The Harley Street fire continued burning for 7 years. In fear, in blackmail, in silence. Her voice remained gentle. People imagine the past disappears simply because it becomes inconvenient. But human actions linger. Pierce nodded slowly. "Yes," he said at last, "I suppose they do." They parted at the lane. Miss Marple continued home beneath the deepening twilight while somewhere nearby a piano played faintly through an open window. Rosehill looked peaceful once more, and perhaps for a time it truly would be. Yet Miss Jane Marple knew what lay beneath all human communities, beneath villages, families, marriages, and respectable drawing-rooms alike. Weakness, loneliness, vanity. Tiny hidden sparks capable under the right conditions of becoming terrible fires. At her cottage gate she paused and glanced back once toward the quiet village green. Then she smiled very slightly to herself. Human nature never changed, which, she reflected, was precisely why one could so often depend upon it. April arrived gently in Rosehill. The village softened beneath pale sunlight and drifting blossom. Window boxes filled again with primroses and geraniums, and the sound of lawn shears returned to gardens neglected during winter. The horror of the previous autumn seemed, to many villagers, already half absorbed into memory. Yet memory in Rosehill behaved rather like ivy. It faded gracefully on the surface while clinging stubbornly underneath. Miss Marple observed this one bright afternoon as she sat beside the window of the Bluebell Cafe drinking tea with Mrs. Elcott and Mrs. Simmons, both of whom had sworn solemnly not to discuss that dreadful business before immediately doing precisely that. "I still say," Mrs. Elcott declared, lowering her voice dramatically, "that Ashcombe House ought never to be lived in." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Simmons. "A house cannot help murder." Mrs. Elcott sniffed. "Perhaps not, but some places absorb unpleasantness." Miss Marple stirred her tea quietly. She had often thought the same herself. Not literally, of course. She did not believe walls remembered crimes in any supernatural sense, but human beings did. And wherever human beings gathered, memory lingered invisibly in habits, silences, and half-finished conversations. "Apparently the house is to be sold," Mrs. Simmons continued. "To whom?" "A retired colonel from Bath, I believe." Mrs. Elcott looked scandalized. "Well, I wouldn't sleep there." "My dear," said Miss Marple mildly, "most houses contain histories their owners never discover." Mrs. Elcott considered this unhappily. The cafe bell jingled suddenly as Tom Fletcher entered carrying a crate of vegetables from his father's farm. He looked healthier now than he had for months, broader in the shoulders again, less haunted around the eyes. He noticed Miss Marple immediately. "Afternoon, Miss Marple." "My dear Mr. Fletcher." "Mrs." Elcott gave him a look combining sympathy and curiosity, the two emotions villagers most frequently confused. Tom set down the crate awkwardly. I wondered if I might walk you home later."
"Of course."
Mrs. Elcott's eyes widened instantly with speculative delight. Miss Marple pretended not to notice. Half an hour later she and Tom walked slowly together along the village lane beneath flowering hedges. For a time they discussed entirely ordinary things: weather, planting, Mrs. Dalrymple's disastrous attempt to organize a spring concert. Then at last Tom said quietly, "I saw Mrs. Carrow." Miss Marple looked up. "Indeed? She's staying in a small place near Bournemouth now." He hesitated. She looked— "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Fear changes once it ends." Tom frowned slightly. "I thought people would look happier afterward." "Sometimes they do." "And sometimes?" Miss Marple considered. "Sometimes people discover they no longer know how to live without fear." She glanced toward him gently. "One becomes accustomed to survival." Tom was silent for a while. Then he said, "She asked about you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How kind." "She said you saved her life." Miss Marple shook her head. "I merely noticed what others ignored." They reached Hollow Lane together. The woods beyond Ashcombe House had begun turning green again, though traces of winter still lingered in the bare upper branches. Tom slowed near the old quarry road. "You know," he said quietly, "I still think about that night. If I hadn't argued with Finch publicly—" "My dear boy," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "murderers do not require perfect excuses, only available ones." Tom gave a faint, grim smile. "I suppose that's true." Miss Marple paused beside the lane. "Guilt is a curious burden," she said softly. "Innocent people often carry it far more heavily than the guilty." Tom looked at her thoughtfully. "Did Dr. Carrow ever feel guilty?" Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. "Oh, yes," she said after a moment. "But not for the things that mattered most." That evening after supper Miss Marple sat alone beside her fire while twilight deepened outside the cottage windows. The village had grown quiet again. Somewhere nearby a wireless played dance music faintly through an open window. A bicycle rattled briefly down the lane. Then silence settled once more. Upon the small table beside her rested a letter received that morning. From Evelyn Carrow. Miss Marple picked it up again thoughtfully. The handwriting remained delicate but steadier now than before. "Dear Miss Marple, there are mornings now when I wake without fear for several seconds before remembering everything that happened. Oddly enough, those few seconds feel more frightening than the fear itself once did. I sometimes wonder whether people can truly begin again after certain kinds of damage. But I wanted you to know that I am trying. Yours sincerely, Evelyn Carrow." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. That was perhaps the most any human being could ever honestly do. She rose slowly and crossed toward the window. Outside, Rose Hill rested peacefully beneath the spring night. Lamplight glowed softly through curtains. Gardens breathed damp earth and blossoms into the cooling air. A peaceful village once more. Yet Miss Marple knew peace was never permanent. Human nature continued quietly beneath it all, with its vanities, longings, jealousies, fears, and hidden griefs. Somewhere, someday, another small spark would catch. Another seemingly ordinary life would crack open to reveal darkness beneath respectability. And when that happened, people would once again say, "How shocking!" Though it never truly was shocking at all, only human. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself and drew the curtains closed against the night. By early May, Rose Hill had fully surrendered to spring. The hedgerows burst thick with hawthorn blossom, and the village green shone fresh and bright beneath long golden evenings. Children played cricket near the church wall, while gardeners knelt proudly among tulips and newly turned soil. Outwardly, the village seemed untouched by tragedy once more. But Miss Marple knew better. No village ever entirely forgot its dead. Even when names faded from conversation, certain pauses remained. Certain glances, certain roads people preferred not to walk alone after dusk. Hollow Lane was still quieter than before. Ashcombe House had finally been purchased by the retired Colonel Mrs. Simmons mentioned. Though workmen spent weeks airing rooms and repainting walls as if fresh wallpaper might erase memory itself, Miss Marple observed these efforts with private amusement. Human beings were extraordinarily hopeful creatures. That evening she attended a small gathering at Gosmead hosted by Mrs. Bantry. Nothing formal, merely tea, sandwiches, and several villagers determined to prove Rose Hill had become cheerful again. Colonel Bantry stood near the fireplace discussing fishing with Dr. Haydock while Mrs. Elcott criticized modern hymn arrangements to anyone unfortunate enough to stand nearby. Miss Marple sat quietly knitting. As usual, people forgot how much one heard while knitting. "She'll never really recover, poor thing," Mrs. Elcott whispered behind her teacup. "You mean Mrs. Carrow?" Mrs. Simmons lowered her voice. "I heard she intends to leave England altogether." "Probably wise," Mrs. Elcott replied. "People remember things." Miss Marple's needles paused very slightly. People remembered. That was both the comfort and cruelty of villages. Later, as twilight deepened outside, Mrs. Bantry settled beside Miss Marple with a sigh. "Well," she declared, "perhaps Rosehill may finally enjoy a peaceful summer." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Dolly, one should never tempt fate." "Oh, nonsense." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "If another murder occurs this year, I shall personally move to France." Colonel Bantry overheard from across the room. "France has murders too." "Yes, but at least they have decent wine while committing them." The room laughed warmly. For the first time in many months, the atmosphere felt genuinely light. Miss Marple looked around quietly at the familiar faces glowing softly in lamplight, ordinary villagers discussing weather, gardens, and trifling disputes once more. How fragile peace always was, and how precious for precisely that reason. As the gathering ended, Dr. Haydock escorted Miss Marple toward the door. "You look tired," he observed gently. "My dear doctor, at my age that is hardly medical news." He smiled. "Still, you've had an exhausting winter." They paused briefly in the hallway. Then Haydock said thoughtfully, "You know, Pierce told me something curious." "Oh?" "He said you solved the case almost entirely through psychology." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. "Human beings are rather repetitive." "Yes, but most people notice facts before character." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "That is why most people become confused." Outside, the evening air felt soft and mild after the warmth indoors. Tom Fletcher waited beside the gate holding his bicycle. "Miss Marple, may I walk you home?" "You are becoming very attentive, Mr. Fletcher." He laughed awkwardly. "Whoa, someone ought to make sure you don't go solving crimes alone at night." "My dear boy," said Miss Marple dryly, "crime rarely consults my schedule." They walked slowly together beneath the fading evening sky. Rosehill looked beautiful at dusk. Windows glowed amber behind climbing roses. Somewhere a piano played softly. The scent of lilacs drifted across the lane. After a while Tom said quietly, "Do you ever get frightened?" Miss Marple looked up at him. "Certainly." "Even during investigations?" "Oh, yes." Tom seemed surprised. "But you never show it." Miss Marple smiled. "One learns." They walked a few steps further. Then she added gently, "Courage is not lack of fear, Mr. Fletcher. It is merely behaving properly despite it." Tom considered this seriously. "You sound like my mother." "That is probably because your mother is sensible." He laughed aloud at that. At Miss Marple's cottage gate he hesitated. "Do you think Rosehill will forget everything eventually?" Miss Marple looked back toward the quiet village. "No," she said softly, "but memory softens." "How?" "Time rearranges pain into stories." Tom frowned thoughtfully. "And that's good?" "Usually." After he left, Miss Marple remained a moment beside the gate beneath the darkening sky. The village lay peaceful around her. No smoke, no sirens, no frightened whispers drifting through autumn mist, only spring night settling gently over cottages and gardens. At last she went inside. The sitting-room felt warm and familiar. Her knitting basket rested beside the chair, the kettle hummed softly over the fire. Miss Marple sat down slowly with a small sigh of contentment. There would always be more mysteries somewhere in the world, more hidden sins, more carefully buried truths waiting beneath respectable surfaces. Human nature guaranteed that. But tonight at least Rosehill slept quietly. And for an elderly lady who had spent months staring into ashes, that seemed quite enough.
This audio was created with async.com.